Episode 10 of Life on Earth is called Themes and Variation, and it continues to talk about mammals. So this episode mainly deals with the more extreme types of mammals, if you know what I mean. I'll get to that. But the first animal we'll look at is a tree shrew. So tree shrews are probably one of the more, I would say, underrated mammals, but ones we just don't really think about. And it's interesting because the vast majority of mammals at a certain point in Earth's history looked a bit like a tree shrew. Like, it's a small arboreal insect eater. It kind of looks like an amalgamation of a few different types of animals. Definitely shrews, definitely squirrels, kind of primates. They're actually more closely related to primates and colugos than they are to anything else. But regardless of what it's closely related to, it is pretty much a model example of what the first mammals were like. It's interesting when Attenborough looks at fossils of the earliest mammals that were around at the time of the dinosaurs. They actually do look a bit like a tree shrew, and even the interpretation of it with the hair on is also pretty much identical to a tree shrew, even though it's not closely related to it, and it's obviously a completely different type of animal. That is the default shape. I thought that was really interesting and a really good way of starting this episode, because we do branch pretty far from that original body plan, and we start looking at other sort of small insectivorous mammals, but not necessarily the ones you'd think of. We don't look at shrews or hedgehogs, we look at desmans. So desmans are a pretty cool animal. I really like them. They're basically a semi-aquatic relative of the mole. They've got a very pronounced nose, which is very good for detecting invertebrates in the water, which is where they feed. And we see them just swimming about, grabbing worms. We see it probably tussling with this freshwater worm species. That's really good. This is actually a really good bit of footage, because you don't really get much footage of desmans out there. The only other one I can think of is the one in Life of Mammals, and this is definitely more in-depth, I would say. So this is probably the best footage of desmans we've ever had, and I thought it was really good. It was probably one of the highlights of the episode for me, just because I've never really seen anything like it since, to be honest. It's really good, and that allows us to springboard pretty easily into the star-nosed mole, which is also very like a desman. You can see how closely related desmans are to moles. Attenborough actually hypothesizes that the first moles were more like a desman. I can kind of see that, because the star-nosed mole pretty much lives in a very similar way, especially when it's in water. When it's underground, it's obviously much more like a conventional mole. We see it killing earthworms and then storing them for later. The star-nosed mole is just really cool. It's a really cool animal. It was probably one of the first times it had ever been filmed in this series, I think. I think people probably knew about it, but they probably had never seen it before, much like the Tasmanian devil in the last episode. I thought that was pretty good. Again, the stuff with the moles was pretty good. The other insect eaters we look at are the much larger ones that have long pronounced snouts that feed on termites and ants. There's obviously a few different examples of mammals that evolved that body shape, which is very well adapted to that lifestyle, even though they're not closely related at all. You've got your aardvarks, you've got your anteaters, your pangolins. The pangolin's probably the one that's the most different, I would say, obviously because it's got the scales, but it's the same principle, basically. The silky anteater was really cool, because I don't think I've ever seen silky anteaters in a series like this. They're actually, pretty adorable, and it's kind of weird that we don't see them more often. It was just this little cute anteater with his baby on its back for, even extra cuteness, just climbing through the trees, and that was it, really. It was perfectly fine. And some of the footage of the anteaters was great. The giant anteater is really good. The tamandua is great. Like, all this stuff with anteaters I like, because I just like anteaters. I don't know why. Something about that body shape and that type of lifestyle, I just find it interesting, animals that have that. I don't know, I'm naturally drawn to them. I don't know why. While insectivorous mammals were able to adapt pretty well to tackling invertebrates in the water and on land, the ones in the sky were a bit of a different challenge. So it's actually interesting to highlight in this episode that for a long, long time, there is no evidence that any group of animals really took to the air at night to feed on insects. Your moths, beetles, mantis, flies, you've got loads of different insects that come out at night. For a long time, it doesn't look like anything was exploiting them. There's so far no evidence that any pterosaurs evolved that specific lifestyle, though some would have tackled insects during the day. There's no evidence to suggest that any of them are nocturnal. There's very few species of birds today that are nocturnal and feed on insects at night, so we can reasonably assume that there weren't any prehistoric ones either. It does look like nocturnal insects were pretty much off the hook until bats evolved. So bats take up a big chunk of this episode. I would say they're the main part of the episode. So if you like bats, this is an episode for you. And bats are interesting. Bats are a bit of an evolutionary enigma. There's no clear links as to where they evolved from. They just sort of pop up in the fossil record, fully formed like they are today. It is very likely, as Attenborough says, that they evolved from small insectivorous mammals that, were feeding on insects in the ground and, wanted to reach ones in the air and evolved wings gradually. That's possible. I think that's probably likely, although we don't really know for sure. I think the closest things to bats in evolutionary history are actually carnivores and pangolins, weirdly. So I don't really know how we how that fits in. But the bats are really good. We basically tackle a wide variety of aspects of bat life. Obviously, them tackling insects at night, they've obviously got various adaptations. Because a lot of insects hibernate over winter, bats are forced to do the same. We see them hibernating, ironically, in the same cave as other insects, like there's moths in there as well. That was interesting. We've seen that a lot since, I think, and probably better because we've got things like thermal imaging camera and stuff like that. But obviously, it was still good to see at the time. And obviously, we talk about echolocation. That is obviously the primary means how bats are able to locate their prey. But it's interesting looking at the different adaptations that various different species of bats have to echolocate. Some of them have got pretty big ears. A lot of them have got these really disgusting fleshy appendages to their face to help pinpoint sound. It is very interesting, and obviously, bats do look pretty disgusting up close, a lot of them anyway. So it was interesting looking at that, because that's something that probably a lot of people don't really realise. Obviously, I think people that know a bit about bats do, but a lot of people probably don't. The most interesting thing for me in the echolocation part of the episode was actually looking at the arms race between the insects and the bats. We see footage of different insects that are actually able to evade bats. We see lacewings that are able to pretty much drop out there when the bats approach them. And species of moth that actually generate their own sounds to kind of confuse the bats. It actually looks like that's a pretty successful strategy for those moths. And we look at other types of bats, like not all bats are insectivorous. There's carnivorous bats, and I'm not talking about the vampire bats. There's this species, it gives the Latin name, but it doesn't give the common name, so I can't remember off the top of my head what it's called. But it basically eats other bats, and it looks pretty terrifying. You see it eating birds. It's really weird seeing a bat eat a bird. I'd never really thought that. Obviously, bats are scary to some people, but most of the time when you see them, they're little, tiny little things that, float past your head. This bat looked pretty scary, actually, eating a bird, and obviously it eats other things like other bats as well. Pretty grim. The vampire bats obviously talked about as well. It's a pretty specialised lifestyle. I think we kind of take them for granted a bit because, the myths of vampires are so intrinsically linked with bats, and vampire bats in particular. It is interesting looking at the way it feeds. We've obviously seen that a lot since, but it's still interesting to highlight. We also look at bats that feed on nectar, but specifically in North America, it seems to be specifically there that has evolved. That's interesting. Fruit bats as well are tackled. Fruit bats are very different from most other bats. They don't echolocate at all, and a lot of them do come out in the day. Amber even suggests that they evolved convergently from a different ancestor. I think that's probably very unlikely. I'm pretty sure fruit bats are more closely related to other bats, although they are probably the most different of the Chiroptera, I would say. The last bat we look at is the fish-eating bat, which is interesting. We see it basically do what we've seen a lot of times since, going out, skimming the water, hooking fish with its teeth and then bringing it back to feed. They don't have any skin between their legs because obviously that would be a hindrance in the water. Their claws are very sharp to properly hook in fish. I also don't think I'd ever seen them actually eating fish before. That's something that definitely gets glossed over in subsequent attempts at this footage. But it was actually really weird just watching a bat eat a fish. Like, actually watching bats eat things is something you don't see that often. I actually found it quite interesting to look at this episode. That was really good. The bat stuff in this episode is pretty good. I think if you like bats, this is definitely an episode for you. It was quite good. And then we look at the other really extreme animals, the ones that didn't take to the air, but instead took to the water, the whales. This part of the episode opens up with humpback whales in Hawaii. We see Ambra diving with humpback whales, and this is pretty magical. I remember the first time I saw this, like way back when I was in school, and it was a pretty cool bit of footage then, and it still is now, even though we've got a lot better footage of various marine mammals. Obviously, this stuff was pretty groundbreaking for the time, but things like Blue Planet have come out since, and it's kind of blown this stuff out of the water. But it's really cool seeing Attenborough just swimming with humpback whales, and they do highlight the similarities with them and other animals. Things like the anteaters, which have obviously lost their teeth. Big baleen whales have done the same pretty much, and I've just replaced it with baleen, which is essentially, hair, to feed on copious amounts of small invertebrates, much like the anteaters. That was a comparison I did not expect this episode to make, but it was quite cool. And we see various really cool footage of the humpback whales, specifically them breaching. That was really cool. I quite like that. I always like that. And then we look at other cetaceans. Orcas we see briefly. We highlighted there, the killer whales. We see an orca kill a seal, but it's very brief. And I do find this quite interesting, because this was probably one of the first times that an orca kill had ever been filmed, probably. But it's obviously nowhere near as sadistic and violent as the vast majority of subsequent orca hunts have been. Trials of Life onwards have really, brought orcas to the forefront in terms of villainous animals. Narwhals as well are highlighted. They're pretty cool. We don't highlight them too much, but it's almost like they're the most weird looking whales, so we had to look at them. So, fair enough that they're in there. Dolphins get a lot of screen time as well. I will say pretty much all the dolphin stuff is filmed in marine parks. So if you don't like that stuff, which, I think most of us don't, that's maybe something you just have to get over. The footage is still good though. We see a dolphin giving birth, which is quite cool. It's obviously a little bit dated by today's standards, but, it's still still pretty good. I quite enjoyed it. I don't think I've seen that much footage subsequently of dolphins giving birth, so this may be one of the better ones, even though the quality is not as good as subsequent documentaries were. They highlight the ability of bottlenose dolphins to echolocate, and they also highlight the intelligence of dolphins. We see the bottlenose dolphins are being trained to recognise a specific type of hoop, and they're able to identify it on subsequent attempts, and even when they're blindfolded as well, which proves that echolocation is what they're using. The calls that dolphins use are quite good. Amber suggests it's kind of like a language. It's not a language, but it's probably still one of the more advanced forms of communication out there in the animal kingdom. And in the episode with the most complex type of communication in the animal kingdom outside of human speech, and that is the humpback whale song. They highlight how it is kind of a cultural phenomenon, like one whale will start making a song and others will copy it, and eventually it will just spread like wildfire throughout the area. That's a really interesting thing and a really interesting feature of culture in animals. And we end the episode circling back to the tree shrew, pretty much the same footage we got at the start of the episode, where we highlight that all these different animals, these anteaters, these bats, these whales, all evolved from an animal a bit like a tree shrew, and that's really good. I thought it was a really good circular way of ending the episode. It was really cool. The very end of the episode is Amber saying that there's two major types of mammals that we haven't talked about yet, and those are the big herbivores and the animals that hunt them, and that's obviously what we're going to talk about in the next episode, the more conventional mammals, I would say. So yeah, this episode is very good. I think the full circleness of it, with the tree shrew at the start and the end, is very good. The underwater footage is definitely a little bit dated by today's standards, but considering this was 1979, it is still pretty good. I pretty much liked all the stuff in here. I liked the stuff with the anteaters, the moles, the bats was cool, the whales are obviously good at the end. Everything in this episode is pretty good. There's definitely a risk of overdoing the mammal stuff, which maybe later episodes will do, I don't know. It's undeniable that there is a lot of really weird and interesting shapes that mammals have taken, and this episode pretty much celebrates that. I think that was really good. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video, what you think of this episode, let me know, and I'll be doing the next one next week, which as I said is all about the predator-prey dynamics within mammals, so look forward to that. And yeah, feel free to like, comment and subscribe, or don't if you don't want to, it's perfectly fine. And I'll see you next time, and goodbye.